I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm the vice chairman of the Institute. Welcome back for another school year and another year of this series. This is actually the fourth year now that we've done this Paulson Institute Contemporary China series on campus. So a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you who are new, we do this every month, and the focus is contemporary China, and we bring a pretty interesting stable of people to campus, but we try to, strive for a diverse series of perspectives on China. So sometimes we do the economy, sometimes we do politics, we've done foreign policy, we do social trends, we've done youth, we do US-China relations, China and the world, and sometimes we do some fun stuff. We've done arts and entertainment, we've done language, teaching, and things like that as well. So we have a pretty good lineup. We've got about half the lineup set for this year. We're going to kick off with Peter Mattis, who I'm going to introduce in a second. We'll do it again in November. We'll skip December because of the reading period, and then we'll ramp up again in January, and we have some interesting folks coming. In fact, in November, a couple days before the presidential election, we're going to have the top two Asia advisors to the last two presidents, President Obama's senior advisor Jeff Bader and President Bush's senior Asia advisor Dennis Wilder. So we'll have them both together at the same time talking about how the next president, whoever that may be, should handle China, the challenges and opportunities thereof. So that'll be fun. All right, we're kicking off today with Peter Mattis, who's one of my favorite people in the China field. Peter is, I think, one of those really special people in a very interesting and special generation of younger China specialists who are coming into the field with fantastic language skills, an amazing attention to detail, great research skills, good writing skills, and the ability to really dig deeply into subjects that used to be either too hard to touch or that people used to just shy away from completely, but are shedding light on aspects of China that I think are either poorly understood or not sufficiently well understood or tend to be overgeneralized. In Peter's case, that's the security and intelligence system in China. He's not going to talk about intelligence today. He's going to talk mainly about security in a conceptual way. But for those of you who are 20-somethings, 30-somethings trying to come into the China field in some way, Peter's an interesting and useful role model, even at a young age. He was the editor of something called the Jamestown Foundation China Brief, which particularly for China national security, international security types, generated some of the most interesting analytical work, but also documentary work on what's happening in China. And he's been kind of a fixture on the scene for Chinese security studies and understanding China's strategic thinking, strategic choices, and strategic direction, which segues into what we're going to talk about today. So we titled this kind of provocatively, I think, just how strategic is China's national security strategy anyway? Because I find that, especially outside of China, commentary, whether it's government commentary or press commentary, tends to either overgeneralize about that subject or oversimplify a lot of complexity. You often hear that China is playing a traditional Chinese game of chess. Their strategy is masterful, brilliant, has incredible strategic tradition that goes back to Sun Tzu and the Three Kingdoms. Some of that is true. China has incredible strategic tradition and strategic learning and some really interesting strategic thinkers. But let's remember, we also often hear the opposite of that in Asia today, all of China's neighbors are in one way or another in some kind of relationship of tension with it. Japan, South Korea, especially in the last few days, India, Southeast Asia. So China's not really that good at this. Don't they realize all of their neighbors are afraid of them and they're not so good at strategy? So you have one extreme, you have the other extreme. And I remember being in the government after the attacks of September 11 of 2001, when really the whole table of international relations was being turned upside down. And a lot of assumptions that were embedded in US foreign policy, in the foreign policy of other major powers around the world, were really changing because the strategic pieces were in motion, not just in Afghanistan, but more generally. And I was a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, which is a kind of strategic planning staff. And we used to sit around late at night after we'd done our work for Secretary Powell and talk about how other powers around the world were adjusting to these new circumstances. And I remember thinking at the time that China in particular was one of those powers that struck me as not fully appreciating how much the world was changing, in part because there were aspects of Chinese foreign policy that were very traditional, or where there was a lot of inertia built in, and events in the world were happening very rapidly. So I was struck that there were a lot of strategic opportunities for China that I was surprised that China didn't seem to be seizing. And then I had colleagues who felt the other way, who thought that Chinese statecraft was such that they were taking advantage of a number of new opportunities, which gets to the debate, just how strategic is China's national security strategy anyway, doctrinally, organizationally, and then above all in terms of the outcomes that we're seeing. So we asked Peter to kick us off for this season of this China series by reflecting a little bit on that in light of the work that you've been doing over the years. I don't know too many people who've looked as hard at this topic, either in terms of what Chinese are saying and writing, but also thinking a little bit about how Chinese foreign policy and national security doctrine is changing. So we're very casual here. We'll have you come up, talk for about, 35 minutes or so, and then people will probably have lots of questions and discussion, but we'll have you do that yourself. It won't be moderated. And then I'll give you time, and we're really looking forward to what you have to say. So with that, welcome to our new year of this, and let's all welcome Peter to Chicago. Welcome.
Thank you. So, first, a big thank you to Evan for inviting me and the Paulson Institute. Evan and I literally have dozens of friends in common, but didn't meet until last year at a conference in a foreign country. Canada. But still, strange enough. The first thing is that when we talk about China and strategy, we tend to swing between two really dramatic extremes. And part of it is because we now take strategy in some ways far too lightly. We overuse the word. There's a strategy for almost anything. In fact, I'm sure that you can find some, how Tsinghua applies to showing up to class on time. We tend to conflate strategy and vision. Just because you come up with a set of ideas, that doesn't actually make a strategy. A strategy is about connecting a set of objectives and ideas to your actions and how they guide it on how you're going to eventually reach that place. And in some ways, China is the victim of a mystique that comes from, well, there's no better way to put it than Zhou Enlai did when Kissinger in his July 1971 visit came and said, thank you for welcoming me to this strange and exotic land. And Zhou interrupted him and said, perhaps if you spend a little bit of time with us, we wouldn't be so mysterious. And so with this sort of mystery of Chinese strategy, we swing back and forth. Either there are these masters of strategy because Tsinghua 2,500 years ago wrote down a few thousand characters that really were the first guide to strategic thinking that's out there in any written language. Or we swing to the side that China is so incoherent. It's so not the monolith that people have described it. So you get reports that come out about maritime actors in the South China Sea that suggest that everything that China is doing in the South China Sea is up to Hainan province or a local militia or the PLA Navy or a host of other interest groups like some of the energy companies. And a sense that Beijing really has no authority or no direction or can't stamp down on this. And yet everything we know about the Chinese Communist Party inside China is that it may not be in control of everything, but it's a little bit like the US Navy around the globe. The US Navy isn't everywhere, just like the Chinese Communist Party isn't everywhere inside China. But when it decides to come and sit somewhere and pay attention and look at it, no one can move them away. So I think there are two ways in which Chinese strategy and strategy making is framed that are indicative of these problems. The first is the Go or the Wei Qi analogy that Kissinger in his book on China made sort of a popular reference. And the second is that the Chinese are aggressive risk takers that don't really understand the kinds of problems that they're creating with their neighbors. On this first one, as Kissinger put it on China, Wei Qi is not a game of annihilation, but rather a game of strategic encirclement. And Westerners are used to the idea of something like chess, which is a game of annihilation. And this is incredibly problematic as an idea. First of all, because how many of China's leaders actually played Wei Qi? In fact, only 2 of China's 10 marshals ever played. Chen Yi, who of course went on to be the president of the All-China Wei Qi Federation, and who was in fact a brilliant player, and Zhu De. But the rest of them didn't play. And what is of all of the games that we associate with any Chinese leader, what is the one that comes to mind? It's Deng Xiaoping as the head of the All-China Bridge Federation. He played bridge. So Deng Xiaoping, I guess if you're going to say games are an analogy for strategic thinking, perhaps has more in common with the Napoleonic era Royal Navy of the United Kingdom than he does with his supposedly Wei Qi playing contemporaries. The second is, when you wander around China, I don't recall ever seeing a Wei Qi board out in public. I saw a lot of xiangqi, a lot of Chinese chess in public. I saw a lot of tiaoqi, Chinese checkers out in public, but never Wei Qi. And it's hard to say that xiangqi is not a game of annihilation like Western chess. It's basically the same thing with a few differences. The third, and this foreshadows a little bit of the rest of the talk, is that if you look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party and People's Liberation Army warfighting, they are not stories of strategic encirclement. The Battle of Wuhan is not a story of a siege or moving pieces to make things go. It is a battle of annihilation, where one of the reasons why the CCP was victorious in the Civil War against the nationalist Kuomintang was because they kept basically turning around prisoners of war from the KMT and sending them back into the fight. And so as the KMT lost prisoners, the CCP gained strength, kept throwing them in, and Chiang Kai-shek refused on every single occasion to ever use former PLA soldiers as part of the KMT army. It didn't matter how loose their affiliation, it didn't matter whether they were forced. And so in these giant battles where literally tens of thousands of men were thrown at each other, this wasn't about encirclement, this was about sort of absolute destruction, and it has more in common with Verdun than any kind of slow, strategic, moving a piece here and a piece there and building in a little fortress over here. And the final problem with it really is that too often we go from Wei Qi to Sun Tzu to winning without fighting, which of course is Sun Tzu, but is in the Science of Military Strategy and other sort of high-level PLA documents about military strategy, is that we use this as the beginning and the end of strategic thinking or Chinese strategy, and that's not helpful. It's a rich civilization with a lot of literature and a lot of debate. These are ideas that have been controversial at any given time. One probably apocryphal story about Marshal Chen Yi is that during the Civil War, he threw his Wei Qi board into the river and said, if you play Wei Qi or you fight a war the way you play Wei Qi, you're never going to win. And so he said, when the war's over, I'll pick it back up. On the other side, for China's risk-taking, we use, again, it's a similar problem of that we're using images rather than what China does or the documents themselves to describe Chinese strategy or their risks or their foolhardiness. We're letting the image, the public relations side of it, decide what is the problem. I think the best example of this probably is the declaration in November 2013 of an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. I mean, if you looked at the kind of comments that were coming out, this is destabilizing, this is absolutely unacceptable, you would think that they had taken a shot at a US aircraft carrier. Or there was some other sort of very visceral and physical confrontation that took place. But when you look at it, what happened? The ADIZ is still in place. not much has really changed. And if you think about it, the declaration of this air defense identification zone really had sort of 5 things that you can say behind it that made it not actually such a risky move. First was it was unilateral, entirely unilateral. If Beijing said it existed, it existed. And if they said it existed, no civilian airline of any country was not going to follow the rules because of the sheer risk. Why would you endanger several hundred innocent people just because you weren't willing to sort of make a radio call? It doesn't make any sort of sense. So people were going to act on it regardless. And even as the US government was speaking publicly about the problems of the ADIZ, it was very quietly telling US airlines, like, look, you can't not comply with this because it's too high of a risk for absolutely no reason not to. In terms of China's claims to the East China Sea and the contention with Japan over who owns the Senkaku or the Diaoyutai Islands, diplomacy and passivity don't work. It's been, prior to, say, 2010, you had 30, 40 years of basically a relatively low-key policy of not doing anything. Did Japan budge? No. Did China get anywhere closer to its objectives of having a dispute recognized in Tokyo? No. So they had to do something. And when you do something like this, you're not actually generating all that much risk because you have an objective in mind. It exists because you say it exists. And you're trying to get something a little bit further along. And declaring the ADIZ didn't mean that there were more PLA Air Force or PLA Navy aviation forces in closer contact with Japanese. It was simply a sort of a line out in the sea that was there. They probably calculated in Beijing on a rush back to normalcy. People will make statements and then they'll move on because, does this really matter? It doesn't change the legal framework. There's no new legal claim that arises because of this declaration. Civilian aircraft are still going to fly back and forth across this. So, what's going to be done? And at the end of November, Vice President Joe Biden was headed out to China. And before he went, he said, of course we're going to raise the ADIZ with the Chinese and with Xi Jinping. But we have to remember that we both have a stake in each other's success. And we can't let something like this derail those other aspects of the relationship. Fourth, who got the bad feelings because of China's declaration? The United States and Japan predominantly. Well, when you look at it, those were 2 countries that at this time, in December 2013, the Chinese have become incredibly skeptical of Japanese and US intentions and whether there's any recognition of China as possibly becoming a responsible stakeholder or whatever the US objective is or how it's framed. And so those bad feelings were, in essence, already there. They're already there to be caused or seen. And I think what this allows is, in a sense, to gather new information about US intentions. And when you look at, say, the business strategy books, I think particularly of Richard Rummelt's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy book, he says the process of strategy is really an ongoing diagnostic process, that every single day you're saying, what is really going on here? And you go back to that period, and Xi Jinping has announced the new type of great power relationship as something he would like to see as a framework for US-China relations. And a number of senior US officials, including in meetings with Xi Jinping and others, said, the US embraces this concept. And it meant, essentially recognition of each other's core interests, recognitions of sovereign equality, a willingness to have freer and more open trade and not have things like the arms embargo or other kinds of export controls on. And US officials accepted this and used these words, but there hadn't really been any follow-through, in a sense. So this was a way for China to say, look, this relates to national unity and sovereignty, therefore this is something that really matters to us. This doesn't really matter to you. So how is the US going to react? So if you think of strategy as being an ongoing diagnostic process, in terms of everything that I've just outlined, this ADIZ is not really a risky move. There's no forces coming in closer contact. There's no risk of people on high alert shooting at each other accidentally. It just sort of exists out there and see what people will do. It's no more risky than throwing a stone into a pond. It's not a stick of dynamite. So I think this leads us to an area where we should take sort of three cuts at Chinese strategy. The first is sort of the ideas, the theories, the concepts. The second is organization, and the third is results or achievements. And if we look at the ideas, sort of the concepts that underpin Chinese thinking that you could say Beijing is good at strategy, I think one of the issues that makes them quite strong is that every single major treatise on strategy says this is a language of paradox. You're dealing with situations where you can't have a straight law that says do this at this time. It's that depending on the context, you face the choice of concentrating your forces or dispersing your forces. You face a choice of trying to besiege someone or waiting out an opponent or trying to fight them immediately. You have a choice of fighting or trying to shape the ideas. And these are all they all put you in positions where you come to a paradox. And I think Roger Ames, in his co-authored book, Anticipating China, put this quite well, that paradox and contradiction in Chinese philosophy and language is not so much about refutation as it is in the West, but as a way to illustrate dynamism or to illustrate a continuum of how things might work. So you can put this kind of flippantly. In the West, we come up with this really terrible thesis, antithesis, synthesis that means that you can read, say, 80 pages of Clausewitz, and only on the last 2 pages do you actually get what Clausewitz means. On the Chinese side, you stick 2 characters together and say, this is how it is, and move on. Because you can put, they have opposite meanings, and you can say, here's a situation, or here's an idea of these 2 things, and say, okay, we'll move on to the next thing. And you can see that in Sun Tzu, Sun Bin. You can see it, all the way to the present in the science of military strategy. Here's a paradox of the choices that we face. Let's move on to another set of choices that have to be addressed. I think the other thing that China is good for is that there's a much clearer sense of what Beijing wants, what the government of China wants. And I think it's quite possible to read about the Chinese dream and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and say, well, these are kind of vague. But when you compare it to what the United States says and what things like the national security strategy of the United States say, those things are actually relatively clear. It's not just sort of an incoherent mess of the way we want the world to look like without a sense of how we get there. And you can look through, starting from the PRC Constitution to the Party Congress work reports to the speeches of Politburo Standing Committee members, and you see sort of a coherent page of, this is what we want China to look like. This is what we want China in the world to look like. This is how we want the region to see us. And these are sort of coordinated around, and they get circulated, or at least the Party Congress work reports and the speeches get circulated around, and there's an opportunity for a lot of different people to sort of input their ideas. And the previous work reports provide sort of a framework that everyone has to use to think about these issues. I think the third point about why China is you could say that China would be good at strategy, is the primacy of the political. And everyone has probably heard that line from Clausewitz that war is a continuation of politics by other means. Well, when you look at how China has evaluated, for example, military campaigns, you see, again, a much greater focus on the political side of the outcome. There's probably no better example of this than the 1979 border war with Vietnam. On the military side, operationally and tactically, the only thing that the Chinese did right was a little bit of tactical surprise about when they went across the border. And you look at all of the assessments written by by foreigners, Americans in particular, of this war. It's that the PLA was a failure. It didn't do anything that it needed to do operationally. But if you look at the political outcomes of the 1979 war, was Vietnam intimidated? Yes. Did the United States, think a little bit higher of China because they'd spit in the eye of the Vietnamese and done some damage? Yes. Were the Thais happy with what the Chinese had done? Yes. These were all good things. One rumor that I've been unable to corroborate was a suggestion that there were also domestic political results from this that Deng Xiaoping got, he was able to pin some of the operational failures on sort of domestic political opponents in the PLA and say, see, you guys couldn't do it. Now you have to let me, run national defense and the national economy, and I'm going to essentially scavenge the PLA to support the national economic modernization. The other thing about this is that primacy of the political leads you to think that people matter. And that if you want to implement policy, and if it involves the other, which strategy almost implicitly requires a competitive context, that you deal with the people on the other side. And you think about how to deal with the people on the other side. It's not just institutions, but it's about individuals who are making decisions. And you can see this in a couple of different ways that plays out. When you look at the first generation of a number of very senior Chinese diplomats, or people that were selected to go to negotiations, people like Zhou Enlai, Li Kenong, Xiong Xianghui, a name that's not really known in the United States. These are all people that began their sort of careers in the CCP as in intelligence. These were what CIA calls case officers. And there was a sense for a lot of the meetings that took place, whether it was Zhou Enlai with Kissinger, whether it was Zhou Enlai with Nehru, whether it was Li Kenong at the Panmunjom talks in Korea, that these people were there to play the man on the other side. And there's no better example of this than the 1937 Xi'an incident, where Chiang Kai-shek is kidnapped by one of his generals who says, you need to stop fighting the CCP and turn your energies against the Japanese. Now, there's some work done by Steve Zhang, who's now at SOAS, suggesting that this incident didn't really impact Chiang Kai-shek's decision. But when you read what the CCP writes about it, this is how it works. We got individuals there. We played this marshal and warlord against Chiang Kai-shek, and it saved us. The truth is probably a little bit in between, because Chiang Kai-shek was not the sort of person who was going to remark in his diaries that, wow, the CCP sure changed my mind because they got me imprisoned. But also on the idea side, we do have to say that the CCP is still a Marxist-Leninist party. And even if they don't really believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat being an intermediate stage before true communism sets in, they still have this belief in scientific laws guiding policy. And the problem with that is that if historical and scientific laws dictate how policy is done, when it doesn't go your way, you have to blame someone. And the most natural people to blame are the outside. And George Kennan, in his follow-up article in Foreign Affairs to the one that we know as the sources of Soviet conduct, observed that no ruling group likes to admit that it can only govern by treating its people like criminals. Consequently, there is always a tendency to justify internal oppression by pointing to the menacing iniquity of the outside world. And Kennan's point was that it's very difficult to deal with a country that does that, because you will always be to blame for whatever is going wrong. And no matter how much you give or how much you compromise, there's always going to be the ability to blame you for something, because their policy is based on historical scientific laws that dictate how the country should develop and where it's going to go. And as good as the Chinese are at assessing other things, they can't really touch the inviolability of those laws. And you see it enshrined, again, in the party documents at high levels. On to the second part of organization as strategy. In a book about civil-military relations, Elliot Cohen relayed an incident at the Naval War College when he was teaching there. And he was teaching a course ostensibly on strategy. And after a few weeks into it, one of his students, or several of his students, came up and complained, this is not a course about strategy, this is a course about civil-military relations. And this is in his preface to Supreme Command. And he said, yes. Part because what he was saying is that strategy in wartime is necessarily a dialogue between political objectives decided by a national leadership and a military toolkit saying, how do we achieve those objectives? How do we make these things work? Strangely enough, I had a conversation a couple of years ago with somebody who did their PhD under Elliot Cohen. And he was teaching a course on strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And a couple of weeks into it, some of his students came up to him and said, this isn't a course about strategy, this is a course about organization. He thought about it, he said, yes. And his view from working in the Pentagon as both an Air Force officer and as a civilian was, if you're not prepared to go from briefing room to briefing room, from presentation slide to presentation slide, doing it over and over and over and over and over again, you're not prepared to do strategy. Because governments are large organizations, and you're talking about getting a lot of people to see the world in a particular way and to take actions based upon a particular framework, based upon a shared vision of the future. That's not an easy task when you're talking about hundreds and thousands of people. And there's a reason why we have so many more examples of bad strategy than we do of good ones, because it's hard. And it's hard work to do this organizational side. So one of the pieces where I think the CCP is good for having a strategic outlook and executing upon a strategy is that even if it's been a totalitarian system or an authoritarian system in the past, it has never been about having the screws squeezed down on everyone all the time. There's always been policy entrepreneurialism, that basically the center comes up with a framework and puts it out either in speeches or pamphlets or party Congress work reports or plenary documents. And then after those are out, there's a set of sort of initiatives. The most famous recent one is probably the One Belt, One Road initiative. And there's also a series of, I don't know how you would translate Kohao exactly, but I think it effectively works as shibboleth. That now people around the country can say, well, down in Yunnan province, this is what it means for us. And they can justify a policy proposal based on the framework that's laid out on top. And you can see this, for example, in the People's Liberation Army about how do they resolve the two incompatibles, as they're called, the Liangbu Xiangshing. That was a CMC judgment handed down, I think, in 2006, saying the PLA capabilities are incompatible with fulfilling China's new historic missions, and they're incompatible with fighting and winning a local war under informatized conditions. And when you look at sort of PLA proposals on how to get better and how to become the modern warfighting force that they want to become, you see this, and also now a larger set of subsidiary, 5 have-nots and a few others saying, this is what we need to do to resolve these sets of problems as they apply to the logistics. This is what we have to do to resolve these as they relate to R&D and acquisition, moving weapons to the troops. And this allows, quite frankly, a lot of different things to take place. And it's quite interesting to see that this model of policymaking is in use, or it has been in use since the Mao era, and it continues to be in use on a huge number of different policy fronts. My personal favorite is the national policy about Ministry of Public Security use of Weibo. This was something that began in the late 2000s, and there were different public security bureaus at local levels playing around with what we can do with a Weibo account. And then in the fall of 2011, there was a national conference of the Ministry of Public Security that brought everyone together and said, here are our problems, everyone should do this. Here are the best practices that were learned from this particular public security bureau somewhere in Shandong province, and the best ones from down in Guangdong, and this is what you people need to do. And a couple of years ago, I was at Sina's headquarters, and they said, one of the things that's kind of odd is that the most popular government accounts are public security bureaus. The Ministry of Public Security is the most popular government account, Weibo account anywhere, at pretty much any level. They'll always be near the top. And it's because they sort of had some ideas that didn't have to do with policing or things that would get people turned off or bored. But when there was a riot in Thailand and a lot of Chinese tourists got in trouble, one of the public security bureaus put out a bunch of Weibo posts saying, if you're ever caught in a stampede of people, here are the things that you need to do to keep yourself safe and to keep your kids safe. And thousands of people said, this is very interesting, and passed it on. The other area where you have to look at the organization of the Chinese state is civil-military relations. And it's intrinsically a difficult subject to deal with, in part because there's very little discussion about how the CCP leadership interacts with the military leadership. There's sort of they're all party members, so they're all sort of together. But that's not quite right today, and it never was really quite right, even when the party and the army were much, much closer and intertwined with each other in the Civil War and the Revolution years. If anything, the only feature of this is really that the party secretary is the same person who commands the military. And this gives him a broad set of tools, Xi Jinping in this case, to say, here are the things that I want. Of course, the other challenge of this is that he's only one person. And there's only one person who can do this. He doesn't have a Secretary of Defense. He doesn't have other sorts of civilian advisors that have the ability to reach into the PLA and say, well, what's going on with this? And this is where you can say there are probably some real problems with the Chinese system on strategy right now, which is that the PLA controls all strategic and military analysis. No one else really gets to do this in China. Whereas if the White House says, I don't really like the report that I got out of OSD, even if they wanted to stay in the government, they can still go to the Joint Staff and say, well, what do you think about what OSD is saying about this? Or the White House can go down the block to CSIS, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, to Brookings, to a half dozen others, if not some of the outside consultancies, and get an analysis and a product of policy options that is as good and as well considered as anything they get from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Xi Jinping does not have that option. And this is where the decline of dual sort of political military elites in the Chinese system probably damaged its ability to make a good, coherent strategy and enforce it across the military and civilian divide. In the past, people like Deng Xiaoping, but also everyone below Deng Xiaoping, this is what we forget. Hu Yaobang, our great reformer of the 1980s, was someone who had been in the PLA. He'd been in the general political department, and we say, oh, political commissars, well, what do? They just enforce party loyalty. It's not really a key part of warfighting. Well, if you go to the political work guidelines, there's language that is still in there as of the latest revision in 2010 that contains sort of the detritus of the Civil War, which is about dealing with prisoners of war. The political commissars were the people that motivated KMT prisoners to go back into the fight and fight for the CCP. So again, when you think about some of the big battles of the Civil War, the political commissars were the ones who really won it. It wasn't the guys commanding the CCP that had maneuvered things into force. As the battle progressed and as it went on, these were the ones who were in the fight, making it happen. So with that, I'll move to the results and achievement side of it. This is one of those where we have to say the Chinese results on policy fall somewhere between strategic genius and Edward Litvak's real dismissal of Chinese strategists. As he sort of acidly notes in his book, if the Chinese are so good at strategy, why haven't they controlled their country for much of the last 1,000 years? Because the Qing dynasty was foreign, the Yuan dynasty was foreign, and the foreign influence in a number of the other periods, even the Song dynasty, was constrained to the southern part of China, and the northern part was ruled by essentially Uyghur and Turkic peoples. So I don't think we have to say that they're idiots. I don't think we have to say that they're 10 feet tall. Because at the end of the day, when you look at what happened in, say, the last 60 years, they navigated the Cold War relatively successfully. They went to the brink a few times. But in their brinksmanship with the Soviet Union and with the United States, they also, Mao at least, understood that neither the Soviet Union or the United States wanted to make the kind of commitment to China that would weaken them for the real theater in Europe. And so he had the ability to press and to push harder than we think really should have been the case. Because it almost looks suicidal, the 1968 and 69 clashes on the Amur River on the Soviet-Chinese border in the Northeast. But if the Soviets really weren't prepared to move millions of men into northern China and become a massive occupying force, it wasn't that much of a risk. It was sort of a sharp elbow. You also have to say that Deng Xiaoping engineered a very different China than might have been the case. And he opened it up while maintaining control within. And that's not a small thing. He and others, including his predecessors, his interactions with the United States, like Zhou Enlai, bought Americans into this idea of a partnership with China. And people developed a sense of having a stake in China's success. And that kept them going through the dark years immediately after the June 4th, 1989 massacre and demonstrations. It's kept them going through a lot of ups and downs and different problems with U.S.-China relationships, such as the EP3 incident in April 2001. That's not really a small thing when you think about it. It's continually kept opening, but at the same time, the mechanisms of control were still there, and the country kept on a direction that was decided from within, not imposed from the outside. But you also have to admit some pretty serious failures in terms of the key areas of national unification. Okay, so they got Tibet back, from the Qing dynasty maps. They took back Xinjiang, but that was the 1950s. So what have they done since then? And if you look at the South China Sea and the East China Sea, you've seen some movement on the South China Sea. They've essentially, for all intents and purposes, have Scarborough Shoal. They have fishing rights where they probably shouldn't, simply because their Coast Guard is more capable than anyone else. And by having a big Coast Guard, they're sort of daring any of the militaries there to take a shot at them, to say, we're not the ones who fired first. You guys did. We kept it as a law enforcement issue. You guys are the ones that brought the military into this. But on the East China Sea, at most, they're continuing to demonstrate that the Diaoyutai sovereignty is challenged, or that they will challenge it. And the incursions have gone up and they've gone down, but they still more or less continue. On Taiwan, you have to say, particularly with the election of Tsai Ing-wen, the rise of the DPP as a political force and the self-imposed damage that the KMT did to itself, that they are further from their goal of unification of Taiwan than they have been in a very, very long time. And you can look at this and you have to say, well, they've made very fundamental failures of judgment and assessment, despite the fact that they have hundreds and thousands of contacts and ways of getting information out of Taiwan that are both public and on the intelligence side. They completely misjudged it. And they didn't understand what was going on in Taiwanese politics. And they put the entire burden of cross-strait rapprochement onto the KMT, forgetting that many of these things had begun under Chen Shui-bian and a DPP administration. So you didn't need to stack the deck so hard and so obviously in one particular direction. But that's what happened. So I would just close by saying that these are some preliminary thoughts, but I hope they invite some thinking about, what is the Chinese strategic tradition? What are the sources of ideas and frameworks and analogies that the Chinese use to talk about strategy or to do it in today's world? How do they deal with the very real organizational problems of executing across a very large government. They don't necessarily have the same coercive tools from the center to impose their will upon the provinces or companies. The answer is, this is not something that we're going to be able to figure out. You can't sit down and write a paper and say, this is what it is and this is what it shall be. You can say, well, here are some ideas, here are some questions. And I think that's really the main point. We have to ask a lot more questions about how the Chinese leadership thinks and how they act. And we can't ever leave it as, Sun Tzu wrote this, therefore it's this. Or the science of military strategy says this, therefore this. We actually have to connect the thinking to the organizations, to the actions and results that they achieve.
David Satter has written of Russia's foreign policy as now being determined entirely by domestic politics, of Putin's need to keep legitimacy in spite of a failing domestic economy. How much is China's assertiveness now driven by Xi Jinping's apparent ambition to strengthen his authority or one-man rule? And from that point of view, one could say that even failures could be a strategic benefit, in the sense that policies that produce more conflict, where there's some continuing action, and even failure to get unification with Taiwan, or more hostile relations, as long as there's also assertive activity, can shore up the domestic standing of a political leader. And how much is the domestic politics in conflict with what you could say would be in the long-term public interest of China?
Well, I think in any large country, you have to say domestic politics plays an outsized role in what political leaders do, or at least it affects their attention span. Because if you're dealing with a large, complex country, and it doesn't matter whether it's China today or India today or the United States, or in years past when communication technology was really not what it was, a country like Russia or the Russian Empire, or even the German state before it had really shed all of the different sort of principalities and kingdoms mentality that were within the system. We're complex countries where the people who rose to the top had domestic politics at their core. They didn't sort of work on foreign policy and then somehow become president or chancellor or party secretary. They had to work their way up a domestic political system, and that's what people know best. If there's ever any group of people that's as busy as we are today, and as we claim to be today, in our day-to-day lives, it's always been domestic politicians who have always had to be going to meet people, who have always had to be talking with different stakeholders in their constituencies or in places that they hope to influence. But how those things play out on any given issue, I think, are far harder to understand. Sort of, in part because we don't know that much about internal Chinese politics. In part because some of the things we say about Chinese politics, to me, don't make sense. For example, if we say Chinese nationalism is a huge issue, a double-edged sword that the Chinese Communist Party has created, one of the features of the nationalist demonstrations that they've tried to dial up and dial down has been that the people that are organizers become incredibly cynical about this and drop out after 2 or 3 years of organizing these protests. Well, what's the central rule of pretty much any successful political movement? You have organizers who know what they're doing. They know how to get people on the street. They know how to get votes out. They know how to do any of a host of different operational activities in terms of moving a large group of people in a particular direction. Well, if those people are dropping out, then nationalism is not the threat to the regime that we tend to think it is. It's something that they can dial up and dial down in a hope to influence an outside actor, in part because of our perceptions of what it might be. So I think any kind of absolute judgment about this is very tough because each person is somewhat particular. You could say Richard Nixon in the United States, was an exception of many of our presidents who came with, a view of what foreign policy should be. Well, part of that was because he was vice president, a job which I think John Adams said wasn't worth a pail of spit, or one of the early ones had said that. So he had the time to sort of, and the access within the US government, so go around, ask questions, request briefings here, see what was going on there, who are interesting people doing work on this. And if you don't have that kind of time, you're never really going to get the exposure and expertise on foreign affairs that you really should have. So.
Thank you. So you just mentioned the Chinese strategy, the relationship between Chinese strategy and Wei Qi. I recall the conversation I read in book between Mao and the journalist in 1930s. The journalist asked Mao, I heard that your guerrilla strategy is directly from a Chinese novel called Shui Hu Zhuan. And Mao said, I never read that book. So even though many marshals may not know how to play Wei Qi, some strategy in Wei Qi is so intertwined in Chinese culture, so they may still be influenced by that. Right. And so that actually connected to what I want to ask for the contemporary issue. So right now, there is a seeming contradiction in China that people don't know what's the Chinese leadership's attitude toward America. So China has been an avid learner of America. And also, they try very hard to resist Americans' influence. So what do you think the balance they're thinking about in terms of this Wei Qi strategy or some other grand strategy? Thank you.
Well, in many ways, I think it comes down to sort of Deng Xiaoping's play on a traditional Chengyu, which was, when you open a window, the pests come in. And Deng said, well, when you open the window, you need to put screens up to keep the pests out. And the question has been, I think as he put it, how do you be open? How do you bring things in, but still retain control over the system yourself? And I think that if there's an answer to that question, Stein-Ringen has probably come closest with the book, The Perfect Dictatorship now. That there are a whole host of social, economic policies, whether it's in what the role of state-owned enterprises, whether it's the national defense industries, how do you preserve what you're doing for your purposes while bringing in things that are useful? And I don't think, like I said, it's not that I'm dismissive of Wei Qi as a subject, because it's a very contextual game. And I would just suggest that there are other better ways of thinking about it. Richard Nisbet in The Geography of Thought laid out a number of different experiments that have been done that demonstrated that there were very different ways that people who were products of a Western education and people who were products of a Chinese education started viewing things. And they looked, for example, at how long eyes lingered on different parts of a painting. And Americans tended to focus very specifically on the figures in the foreground and study those in depth. And I think Chinese sort of saw those and then went very quickly to the background and what is the setting that these people are in. And we're sort of exploring much of that larger context. I don't think you can say one is better than the other, but I think if you begin from the idea that it's a conversation, that it's this issue of openness and control, and simply saying that, okay, we're figuring out how to go between these two things, that's where you start to see that's where you should follow and look to see what people are doing.
Hi, I'm Claren. I'm a third year in the college studying history. So I have a question about China's policy on Hong Kong. Where do you think China's policy fits in with your framework of the primacy of politics and also internal organizational structures. To many people in the West, it seems like there's a contradiction that China has a goal of keeping Hong Kong prosperous and free. It needs to have this rich financial capital on its southern coast, but it also has this growing hardline policy. For example, Joshua Wong was recently detained in Thailand at the behest of the Chinese government. So where do you think that fits in with your framework?
Well, I don't think that you've described China's goals toward Hong Kong accurately. If this were the 1980s, then China needs Hong Kong. Because that was the only place with rule of law, and that was the only place where money could move easily. You also didn't have that many Americans who spoke Chinese. You didn't have that many other Westerners who spoke Chinese. And people from Hong Kong, and to a lesser extent from Taiwan, were the people that could serve as intermediaries. That's no longer the case today. The need for Hong Kong, I don't think you can say is quite what it was, that it needs to be as prosperous and free as it once was. I mean, one other elite interest that you didn't mention in Hong Kong is the ability to move money out of China. And, Hong Kong doesn't need to be free for that to happen. It simply needs to be connected enough to the international finance to be able to move money, and to have that money not be seen as money laundering or otherwise sort of illicitly moved and confiscated by foreign governments. So as long as Hong Kong is able to do that, it's still serving an important purpose. There's also, there's so much, our ability to go interact in China much more directly has changed dramatically. And we don't need people who are intermediaries. There are plenty of Chinese who speak excellent English. There are plenty of Americans who speak excellent Chinese and can go and have these conversations directly without someone translating and taking a finder's fee out of the middle of it. The other thing I would say is, if you're going to look at areas of research on China, is that we haven't really understood the policy systems as well as we should have. So if you take the Hong Kong and Macau leading small group, it's been around for decades in some form or another. But we don't really know that much about it, and we don't know about the inputs or what feeds into it. We simply know we have some good guesses about who are the players on it. Xi Jinping from 2007 to 2012, the head of the United Front Work Department, the Ministry of State Security, some PLA members, and a handful of others that probably change here or there. But we don't know how that system plays out and how it functions. But one of the things that's interesting, and I got this from looking at the intelligence side, is we see a lot of stovepipes in the Chinese government. But when you look at a well-developed policy system, like the Taiwan affairs, what's interesting is I can't find good examples of military intelligence, PLA, United Front type people cooperating, and the Ministry of State Security sort of coming together and doing things. But when you look at the cover organizations and the front organizations that run intelligence on Taiwan affairs, these guys are all sitting together. Their home ministries may not cooperate at a big level in the capital, but the guys who actually have to do it all have similar positions and all share organizations to work together. So if we want to understand what's going on with Hong Kong, it's a great area for research, because it is a well-developed policy system that's been around for decades and years with a lot of very specific focus. And they consider it still to be an important enough issue to warrant a Politburo Standing Committee member to oversee it and to make sure that people are doing the work.
Thanks for the insight. My name is Ray. I'm an MBA student at Booth. I also graduated from People's Public Security University of China. So when you mentioned about Weibo, that use case, that resonated with me immediately. So my question is, one of the most important national security strategy emerging now is the tighter control of the internet. And a lot of these Western internet giants, like Google is out, Facebook couldn't get in. What these companies have to think, what kind of questions they have to ask to be able to decide, should we keep investing, trying to get into China, or there's the other way out? Thank you.
Well, I think the very short answers are no, they can't really get in, but yes, they should keep trying to do so because most of their shareholders think that they have a chance, therefore they should appease them and make a nice effort to say we can get in and we can make nice. I think that this is a great example of where we focus on a sort of a specific policy coming out, like elements of internet control, but we don't look at the larger context in which it's taking place. The internet issue is not about control. Yes, there's the Cyberspace Administration of China, that's the executive sort of office for the leading group, but the people that run it come out of the propaganda ministry. That means it fits. We actually have to take a step back and think about what is the propaganda ministry doing or department doing within the party. What is their sort of encompassing goal? How do they do it? And I think we're going to start seeing some very exciting things coming from a young PhD student at Nottingham named Samantha Hoffman on sort of social management and how these different pieces sort of fit together into the control system and how they're being used to shape China today. And I think unless you want to participate in that as a Google or a Facebook, and unless you want to participate in that, and unless you want to make the very real adaptations to your product that would make it useful or enticing for Chinese people to shift from the more familiar forms, you're not really going to have a chance. So there's my answer.
Hello, I'm Teresa, and I'm a first-year student at Harris. And so my question is, before you mentioned a lot about, or you mentioned some about Taiwan and China relationship, especially in this past probably like 20 years, like China actually they really misjudge the society, the change of society in Taiwan, especially in younger generation, and they push Taiwan further away from unification in terms of the society in general. And right now, DPP is a ruling party of Taiwan, and there is a lot of change in the community and in society and between Taiwan and Chinese relationship. But what do you think about the policy of China towards Taiwan in the future 4 years in the new landscape?
What is Chinese policy going to look like towards Taiwan?
Because before they put much of the efforts and attention on KMT, but they want unification and stuff like that. But what do you think is the way they can move forward?
There was also a lot of effort to influence the South, which is the DPP stronghold, in terms of agricultural products and preferential trade deals for getting their goods into China. I don't know what it looks like because I don't think they know at this point what they should do. They can continue pushing, but they've broken off the connections to be able to do that in. So until they're prepared to restart those under the conditions that Tsai Ing-wen laid out, which is, the DPP is not going to acknowledge a bunch of things that we don't think exist in the first place. The DPP will tell you that the 1992 consensus was something that Suu Kyi made up, out of his head to say, we have some way of talking. I think there's a period right now of just sort of, okay, what does this look like? What does the KMT do? Our connections there and our avenues of influence are no longer quite what they were. There have been back channels to the KMT since, I think, the 1960s, if they ever really stopped, because there were so many family connections across the divide. So I think that what we're seeing now and what we're going to see, at least for the near future, is a sense of okay, what do we do? And there's a certain amount that can happen just by letting the natural inertia continue to allow people to move back and forth, even though it's clearly a drop-off in tourism and a drop-off of other sorts of official interactions. But the Taiwanese are still going to China. There's still the Taishan community around Shanghai that does a lot of business and has influence in Taiwan. So I think it's sort of a sort of feeling around the other side to see what might be possible, or whether they should just shut up and not do anything for the next 4 years, and see what the KMT is able to do in terms of reconstituting as a meaningful political party.
Last questions. I can ask the last one. Could you say something about two things? One is learning, and the other is foreign influence. Learning, because when you talk strategy, you talked about Sun Tzu and all these ancient things. Well, here in the West, we read Caesar's campaigns, and we read things. But in the nuclear age, some of that may not have applied, and we had to develop a whole new science of strategy. Then there's the question of foreign influence. There's so much interaction over the last 4 decades between Chinese and the world. How much learning is there in terms of changing concepts, changing approaches? How much does foreign influence really matter in terms of the development of Chinese strategy, statecraft, strategic thinking?
I think that's one of those difficult questions, because the only place where you can see that at sort of an organizational level is the PLA. And very clearly, the Gulf War onward showed them that the PLA as it was currently constituted was completely inadequate to the task. One thing you might remember from the 1996 Taiwan Strait crises is that we had CNN crews on the aircraft carriers because we didn't think the Chinese would know that an aircraft carrier was conducting flight operations in the Taiwan Strait. And we wanted to have the little banner below that said, somewhere in or near the Taiwan Strait, so that it was very clear that there was a US carrier there and something might happen if he got too close. And when Jiang Zemin had to deal with the PLA, he sort of said, well, what are the options? What can we do? And they sort of had to shrug their shoulders and say, well, not much. When the embassy bombing occurred in Belgrade in 1999, Jiang Zemin, I think, went to the PLA and said something along the lines of, what if that happens in Beijing? What can you do? So you can see that there was a fairly dramatic development of, where the PLA went between 1991 and 2001, versus 2001 to 2016. There's a huge, huge shift in terms of what are the capabilities that we need to be able to do, what are the things that we need to do to deal with the United States challenge. We don't have to be able to conquer the United States, but we do need to at least keep them far enough away that they can't hurt us too much, or that they have to think twice about sending an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait or conducting flight operations in the South China Sea. And trying to inject that. So those, I think, were very real material developments. And they had to, you look at a couple of, really tons of studies that were done of the Gulf War, and then also the Soviet views of military technical revolution, and the views of a revolution in military affairs in the United States, and trying to figure out what is this reality of the Gulf War and this age of precision munitions, and these broader technical trends that US and Soviet analysts have identified and brought to the forefront. So there's very clearly an effort to study there, and you can see those ideas integrated into the primary publications. There was a book published this year by the Jamestown Foundation with Joe McReynolds as the principal editor, who works at a defense contractor in DC, and he commissioned a bunch of us to write chapters comparing the Science of Military Strategy published in 2001 and the Science of Military Strategy published in 2013. What does this look like? And if I were to sum up, what my co-author and I did on the chapter on information operations, was that in 2001 it looked like they were sort of studying ideas. Here are these concepts and here are these ideas that we should be thinking about. In 2013, it was much more about, here's warfighting, here's where these ideas plug in, here's how we do it. So there is that kind of learning. But if you're going to look at sort of that personal level, at a set of people who are senior enough to make decisions on a daily basis that will reverberate throughout the system, that kind of reading, I'm not sure. We know Wang Qishan said, you need to read Alexis de Tocqueville to understand sort of state development in the United States. But beyond that, we don't really know what they choose to read or where they draw their analogies, or particularly within the senior-most levels. And to think that we know where, say, anyone who's sitting on the secretariat gets their ideas, since they're the ones who are communicating among the different leaders, we're completely in the dark.
Peter, great talk. Thanks for kicking us off. Let's all thank Peter.